So again, we're pleased to have Charlie Buccola with us today. As you know, Charlie has co-authored a number of books. The most recently, the L&N Big Emma. Charlie also spends a heck of a lot of time down at the KRM, so he's very in the know on not only 152 but other locomotive preservation. So. Charlie, thank you for being here with us today, and I'll let you take over.
Just before Charlie starts, and just so we're not jargon loaded, for those of you not in the know, KRM stands for
Kentucky Railway Museum. Thanks. That's good to hear our chorus. All right. As he said, I'm Charlie Buccola in the flesh. I'm very pleased to be here to have the opportunity to talk with you folks today. And to, as I mentioned to several people that I am acquainted with, to get to see some faces that I do not know, some of whose name I have seen around. I am an NMRA member. I was back in the late 60s and 70s and then went AWOL for a while, but it's good to be in that group. And I am one of those strange ducks that actually likes history. And as such, I'm very interested in railway preservation, which is the key word on our topic today. I wear a number of hats. Today I'll be wearing my KRM hat, but so we'll hear a lot about that, but we'll also delve into some other things. We're going to feature, as was mentioned, the L&N 152, a 462 locomotive that the museum has owned for quite a few years, actually longer than L&N did, and we'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. So like with many things, the things we'll start with is a definition of our terminology, and since now the key word in my little presentation today is preservation, is what are we talking about? So preservation is the act of preserving being, and among the definitions I saw that I like to keep safe from destruction, to keep alive, intact, to keep and preserve for personal special use. And that certainly applies to 152 and quite a number of other things that we potentially could talk about. Part of that too, one of the key words I liked was alive. And most of the people in here have gray hair, so they know that one of the features of steam locomotives that appealed to a lot of people is that it did exhibit some life aspects to it. You could actually see the mechanism, how it worked. You could see the smoke and the steam. Nowadays, that's verboten with the modern diesels and so forth, thankfully, from an efficiency standpoint. So that'll be a key word that we'll be dealing with as we go through here. The poster child for our little talk is 152, which has been owned by the museum, as I mentioned, for many, many years. And we'll use this as an example. There's probably, right now, probably 24 steam locomotives around the country that you could say the same thing about. So as a prelude to what we're going to get into, why restore this steam locomotive? Well, for one reason, it has been restored to operation and it was operable. And then came a time when it had to be taken out of service. And that was in 2012 when it went out of service because it needed a variety of work, particularly some of the boiler tubes. Also, from the early 2000s to the present, the Federal Railway Administration has what's generally termed the 1472 rule. And that is that a steam locomotive has, once it is restored and inspected by the FRA people, can operate for 15 years or 1,472 operating hours, whichever comes first. In KRM's case, it's not operated that frequently, so it's 15 years. So it came out of service, and we could have let it sit as a nice exhibit, but any number of people, some who were involved in the decision-making process, some who are visitors and interested parties, said there is not a need for another stuffed and mounted steam locomotive. So that was a motivation. So the board ultimately approved the restoration, undertook the seeking funding and all the other aspects to make this thing happen. But as already mentioned, steam locomotives are alive, so we want to bring it back to life. Kind of a brief history that we'll go through here. Then we'll talk about the ownership by KRM. the current restoration, and we'll touch a little bit on other preserved equipment at Kentucky Railway Museum. As far as the history, and I don't see any faces here I recognize with Bob not here, that's an NRHS member, but some of this, if you've seen it before, yeah, Bob, I think has. And some of it's been tweaked a little bit, and there's plenty of other stuff that's new. So 152 was built by Rogers Locomotive Works, which eventually became part of the American Locomotive Company, Alco family. Patterson, New Jersey, built in 1905. The cost back then was $13,406, which
Can't even buy a car for that.
yeah, you can't even buy a car for that now. And I brought it up to present value, and it was still only, I think, somewhere around $1 million. So it's not like the modern ES 44AH that go for quite a few millions. It was the third of a 5-engine order. At the time it was built, it was the state of the art. That was as good as you could get. That did not last long, as we'll see. By within 10 years, it was bumped down by newer, better locomotives. It and its sisters, and those we'll get into a little bit more, was used system-wide on the premier passenger trains that L&N was running at the time. Eventually, it was rebuilt into a K2A. It was a K1 when it was delivered to the a class of locomotive, K1, the K series being their Pacifics. But it was rebuilt circa 1911. The earliest, from the time it was built, it arrived in Cincinnati in 1905, February. It was placed in service, we're not sure exactly when, sometime February, March 1905 at Louisville. And coincidentally, South Louisville shops opened in 1905. The L&N produced copies, 20 copies of this locomotive. They liked it so much that were in the K1 class, and that was in the period 1906 to 1907. The 1909-1910 period, the K2 class came along, which was the same as the K1s, but with some new and improvements. Again, the state of the art, just like all things railroading and most of what we deal with, technology keeps improving and improving, which it did. Here's a picture of a K1, one of the sister locomotives, the subsequent ones built at built later on. As you can see, slide valves, the smoke box is a little shorter than we'll see on the K2s, which we'll get into. So these early, not all of them, but most of the K1s went through a rebuild process in the early teens. They replaced the steam chest that we pointed out with a new cylinder casting and support for the smoke box and the boiler for that matter. Piston valves replaced the slide valves. Walschert's valve gear was applied rather than Stevenson, and the cylinder bore was increased 20 to 20.5 inches, which doesn't seem like much until you figure out the area. We've got, I know a number of you are engineers here and know that half an inch in a diameter does equate to a lot more push that you can get out of it. The smoke box was extended to accommodate superheater headers with 21 superheater units, which we'll talk about superheaters just a little bit later on. And that was a new addition, another new technology that came along in that early part of the century, the superheaters. So it went about its business, and as we said, operated system-wide. And unfortunately, it was in a wreck in 13, I think it is. Southbound train 23, which is near Sinks, which is near Livingston, Kentucky. So you're liable to see if you look that up, either location. It was a derailment due to heat buckled rails, which those of you who are familiar with railroading know that summertime, that's still a problem nowadays. The tender body detached from the frame and slid forward into the cab, and unfortunately, both the engineer and fireman were killed. Excuse me, the train 23, just as an aside, again, an indicator that it was operated over the system. 23 was a train that went from Louisville to Norton, Virginia. So it went Louisville down to Livingston area, Corbin, over the Cumberland Valley, over to Norton, Virginia. So it did get around. Okay, as mentioned, it was the state of the art, newer and better locomotives.
Got a question.
Question?
Go ahead, Bob.
No, that train went from Louisville to Corbin through the KRM property.
Well, that's true too.
Yeah.
So
It stops.
yeah. And that's, you mentioned, as far as KRM, it is nice to be on the Lebanon branch. Well, I remember there'll be another mention of things that are at KRM that operated on that branch. So newer and better, the K3s, K4s, K5s were coming along. So by the 1920s, 152 and its sisters are bumped down to secondary runs or down to the southern part of the system where it's much flatter. You don't have the mountains and as many of the heavier trains as were operated up on the Kentucky division, the Louisville division, and this northern part of the system. We have seen, or I have found several locomotive assignment lists that bear out what we'd heard anecdotally as far as where it was in the latter part of its system. And it tended to be down at the M&O division, and then the last years were at Pensacola. And one indicator of the M and O, you probably can't see it too well, but it has an automatic train stop box up there, which locomotives like that were pretty much relegated to that one system that the ICC required that system be on passenger locomotives. So it was down there in Pensacola. Come the early 50s, it and its sisters are being retired. In 1955, it was stuffed and mounted, basically, used it as a display at the Mobile's new passenger station. In 1956, the L&N president, John Tilford, he ordered it to be preserved, and then it was ultimately moved to South Louisville shops. Tilford was a steam fan of sorts, and he grew up seeing locomotives like this, so it was meaningful to him as we understand it. Again, anecdotally, words have been passed down. So that got 152 preserved, and it's South Louisville shops. We see it on the transfer table over here. And in 57, it gets cosmetically restored. In this same period, mid-50s, the local chapter of the National Railway Historical Society was making the move to have a railway museum here in Louisville. And this 152 was the first piece of equipment that was donated for the beginning of the museum. So it is very significant to KRM being the cornerstone piece of equipment and certainly has the right size for the organization. So in 57, KRM has been started. It has property on River Road. The donation has been made and it is moved to the River Road location, but it doesn't make it. The reason being that even though it's a 462 technically, the rear truck doesn't swivel in the case of trailing trucks that we're most familiar with on steam locomotives. So you could make the argument that it's really a 480 and it has the wheelbase of that length. And some of you may have been around when there was still the trackage to where the Railway Museum was on River Road, but there were some tight curves in getting in there, and the track had to be rebuilt to get it in there. And as Charlie Kastner said, the guy who was train master then hoped that he was long retired before that thing got moved out of there, which I don't know if that was the case or not. At any rate, in the late 50s, the volunteers at Kentucky Railway Museum steam it up twice a year, basically to keep it dried out in good condition. And then that stops. March of 64 was the big flood. The water in that flood came up to the little L&N placard you see on the middle of the cab there. So it was pretty deep, and that was one of the motivations for KRM to find a new location. So the restoration begins. It again came to the Kentucky Railway Museum as a non-operable piece of equipment. It probably had not had much work done on it at all in the early 50s since it was running out of time. And the brave volunteers at KRM restored it there. You see the thing stripped down to the boiler. You see here in the stages of later work, but the volunteers there. We'll go through this real quickly rather than spend a lot of time. But the board at KRM back in those days talked about it, and in 71 finally had an inspection by a superintendent of motive power at the South Louisville shops come and have a look at it, and they decided to go ahead with the restoration. And so I don't fail to mention it later. In the early days, all through the restoration process, one advantage Kentucky Railway Museum had was there was still a lot of Boilermakers around and people who had firsthand experience with steam locomotives. So there was work done at the River Road site, and there was a lot of things done at South Louisville shops, the government work. Yeah. Mike.
Long before I was involved with any of the modeling or KRM or anything else, I was in the National Guard. And one of my jobs in the National Guard was a crane operator. Well, one weekend I showed up for duty and they said, you gotta go to River Road. So I went down there and ran the crane and took the spoiler off of the frame down there on River Road. Wherever in that time frame it was, I don't remember exactly when, but that's when I was in the National Guard. And I never put it back on. I don't know who did that, when or whatever, but I took it off and set it on cribbing that they had there.
Okay, well, this is a good data point for me to have for the future. So at any rate, early 70s, it's going through the disassembly process. 75, as we see on this next slide, they're really getting down to business and getting to work on the boiler, that is the key, as you can imagine, to any steam locomotive and really the big safety thing. So work continues. The tender that is behind 152 right now was acquired at that time from Heart of Dixie, a really fine museum. If you've never been down there, it's a little bit south of Birmingham. They're able to swap some equipment. It's from an L1, which is a 482. Reason being, with aspirations to run this locomotive, there's not a water plug every 50 miles anymore. So you wanted a bigger capacity than the original tender that came with 152, which is still in existence down at KRM if anybody's curious about that. So through the 70s, work has continued. Wheels are going down to Birmingham and other places. And by the late 70s, all the other equipment except 152, so it's in work, has been moved to the new location at Ormsby Station out at the Dorsey Lane area. So back in 79, where things are really getting done, we're at a turning point where things have come apart. Now we're really going back together again. The frame and the boiler are lifted back onto the drivers. We're getting tubes installed and so forth, the thing that really makes it possible to operate it. 1980, a key milestone, that is an initial hydro test. That's a test where basically you fill a boiler, and this applies to my understanding, just about any boiler, and you pump it up to 150% of its rated boiler pressure. And if it survives that, you're probably going to be good to go. So it passed that test, obviously. Early 80s, we have more restoration continuing where we're really getting things back together. And now we'll diverge into some details because I thought this was really interesting and it shows the dedication of volunteers, and that could be applied to any volunteer who will go above and beyond the tour of duty. So I mentioned earlier this trailing truck, and then all the wheels it's been off the wheels and it has to get put where it can be put under the locomotive. So they literally dug a pit by hand to make a temporary drop pit, which we're seeing here, the digging. Then we're seeing the blocking where that trailing truck is set up so it can be lowered down. It's lowered down into that pit. They bring the rest of the locomotive over it, and the trailing truck is brought up and put in place, and there we have it. So, and then fill the pit in. But again, very industrious and very imaginative. Early 80s, now we're getting back to the finer details. Originally, as you may have noted from other pictures you've seen, the 152 had twin single-phase air compressor pumps. A cross-compound pump was put on it, again, from the standpoint of being able to pump up enough air for a big, long, heavy train. So the 1984 final work is done. Through the early 85, all work gets completed, inspections are done and so forth. So by late 85, you have this locomotive ready to go. And these are some pictures of the locomotive when it is ready to go in its newly refinished status. So in the fall of 85, in October, they have basically a trial run as far as an excursion, and 152 takes a train to Lexington and back, and successfully. So then the real fun starts. They're at Ormsby Station, and they do operate 152 occasionally back and forth there. And again, the industriousness of the volunteers at KRM actually built a Y at Ormsby Station location so that the locomotive could be turned to run trips northbound or southbound. Now we come into 1986 when it begins the late 80s excursion operations that 152 did and was quite busy. Spring and summer, we see trips that are centered pretty much in the area not too far from Louisville, going to Lexington, down to the Bardstown branch, Lebanon Junction over to Lebanon, a trip that it would make occasionally to the Ham Day celebration that they have in Lebanon, Kentucky. Late in 86, in October, it takes a big long tour, which was quite an interesting operation, and goes from Louisville all the way to Appalachia, Virginia, and back. So it covers a lot of ground, ends up down to Jellicoe, Tennessee, and then returns to Louisville. 87, 152 becomes part of the Norfolk Southern Steam Program. And again, it operates generally to the eastern Tennessee area. Actually, would be better to say than going over through central and eastern Kentucky. But as you can see, it makes it down to Harriman, which takes it over to Knoxville, which gets it over to where it can run up to Radford, Virginia, and then as far as the Old Fort area out of Asheville in North Carolina. And there is a picture from it on the loops when it went to Old Fort, which, as many of you are aware, it was that currently is out of service now due to the hurricane damage. But my understanding is that Norfolk Southern will eventually reopen that segment of train. So it did get around. 1987 trips both east and west of Louisville. It makes it over to Pittsburgh. It goes over to Lexington, to Winchester, Paris, and Maysville. 1988, again, we find it pretty much in north central Kentucky. Again, a short trip over to Irvington to the west, but then again down to Lebanon, Kentucky, a favorite location, Winchester, Paris, Maysville, and these areas. And there was a photo charter that John Kraft did, and that's did at Carlisle, Kentucky on the photo charter run. So they did have some nice operations. And not to be overlooked is that KRM did have a very good relationship with the local CSX people, and through at various points in time, 152 would take short trips running excursions for CSX employees in the Louisville area. And this is at the location FX. Tom Gunther has one of these signals, as I recall. But it would run from Strawberry Yard to South Louisville and back, but people apparently enjoyed the ride. So in that time, the museum had relocated to New Haven, which operates tours there ever since, that runs excursions. And again, the locomotive is right sized for that operation. Anything bigger would be a waste of energy and require a lot more track maintenance than would be affordable. And it certainly is able to pull the trains that need be. So the restorations there. In the 96 to 98 period, again, this was all volunteer work where some necessary work, particularly in the Firebarks area, was conducted and got it back in service until the aforementioned 2012 out of service date, 2014 board commitment to restore the locomotive. Okay, an aside here, since we're talking about historic preservation, it's a lot more than locomotives and even cars. There are other things that are very worthwhile to have and have access to. One thing KRM has, both by virtue of its own collections and then stuff that the steam crew left, was a lot of the drawings and other data, which is obviously very helpful for the restoration of this locomotive. We're seeing here, and I'm sure from a distance it's hard to tell, up in the corner, a piece part drawing, and there is a full side view of a K1 or a K2A locomotive. Again, if you're real close, you can see a lot of the details on it. Okay, to overhaul a locomotive or overhaul anything, you've got to take it apart. So we'll go through here step by step in a way of the thing coming apart. First thing that come off are like appliances. This is the cross compound pump being removed. Cab came off. The various sheathing came off, exposing flagging. Everybody likes sparks, so here's a picture inside where the ends of boiler tube are being ground off. These are superheater tubes coming out. And in the course of preparing for this restoration, at least 4, if not more, ultrasonic inspections have been made of the boiler. Typical way to do this, and it's really hard to see, I doubt if you can, but there are 6-inch squares drawn all over the boiler. And at those inspection points, there's data recorded of what the ultrasonic reading is. So this is one of the first ones that was done by a contractor and provided a lot of data. The KRM people themselves did another one subsequent to this. The contractor who has the boiler now has done at least 2, but that's requisite to get sure to do the right stuff. Here is Toby Asher, the former trainmaster here in Louisville, who is also a KRM occasional volunteer working on taking the rods off. Okay, the kind of work that's been conducted at KRM is various major and minor sub-assemblies, obviously. The air compressor has been rebuilt, a dynamo, which generates the electricity for lights and so forth, rebuilt. The pilot truck has been rebuilt by volunteers, and there's various work under the on the tenders, particularly in both of the trucks, have been pulled out to be worked on. This is the pilot truck when it was out and then being reinstalled. Here is the dynamo being worked on, and I make the comment that people are important, and that's just like this organization, any volunteer organization, you're really dependent on your people and what they bring to it. The person in the back is Rob Minton, who's currently the head of the steam crew and has had experience with down at Birmingham and other places and is really into this stuff, which is a good thing. In the front is Lewis Hicks, who is currently a volunteer, and in one of the early pictures we saw at River Road, he was a teenager volunteering then. So it's been great to have Lewis still with us. I think he's the only one left. We've lost through various means other people who had worked on it earlier, but it's nice to have this tribal knowledge that gets passed down, and that's again important to any organization, for profit or nonprofit. As this is 2015, a celebration of 152's 110th birthday. So we do try to enjoy things as well. More of the disassembly. Here's the boiler being lifted off. One of the pieces of equipment that KRN has is a crane, which is operable and gets used very regularly. And now that we know Mike's background, we'll have to kidnap him and bring him down here. Some things were a little more than the museum wanted to handle or could get the crane to where it could do this. So Busick, who's made tons of money building rick houses down in the central Kentucky area, they were kind enough to donate a crane for the day and did a fine job of lifting the frame off of the wheels so the wheels could go elsewhere. A contract was placed several years ago for work on the locomotive for things that were beyond the scope that the museum volunteers could really handle, either by people available or the equipment necessary. And that would be the boiler, the running gear, and the wheels. The contractor is Next Generation Rail Solutions, who now rents space from Kentucky Steam Heritage down at Ravenna, Kentucky, and is doing this type of work. Here's an example of the prep on the wheels. A lot of grinding was done. Found a lot more cracks than expected in those wheels that are being repaired. And a key part, obviously, you've got to have those wheels in good shape for a safe operation. Contractor work was progressing along nicely, and then came the unexpected. Bob was an engineer at Naval Ordnance Station, our former employee, and I know the engineers used to tell me all the time that the known unknowns weren't much of a problem. It's those unknown unknowns that'll really get you. And in this case, there were a couple of gotchas. The more simple of the two being that 2 of the driving boxes, that's where the drivers sit on, had to be replaced, which was somewhat unexpected, but that's not that much of a big deal. I think that's about a $7,000 oops. But the real killer is that all three of the boiler courses, the boiler barrel is going to have to be replaced. We were planning on replacing one of the courses due to its condition. But as we see here, the real big surprise was in beginning the disassembly of the boiler to put this new course in, they found that the expected, that is rivets being driven through holes that were aligned, was not the case. Many of them were misaligned, which has led to a lot of problems with the rivets. There's not enough space between the end of a course and where the current holes are to make new holes. So this is going to cause the whole boiler barrel being built as a welded assembly rather than a riveted assembly. But nobody will ever know, nobody will ever see that as far as the visual. It will be riveted back onto the smoke box and riveted back onto the firebox area. But why did this happen? And again, it's good to know people. There are a lot of steam people around in this country who are very knowledgeable of what they're doing today, what and why from the old days. And apparently back in the year when 152 was built in 1905, the Rogers Locomotive Work found it was a lot quicker and cheaper to punch holes for rivets than it was to drill all of them. So you get these mismatches in location, which really didn't matter when they were putting it together. You're driving a hot rivet through, which will conform to whatever it's going through, but trying to take those things out is very difficult. And then you still have a misalignment program that would probably not pass muster with the FRA. So we'll put on our begging hat. We're seeking more donations. If you personally, organizationally, know anybody you can recommend to us, we're all ears and we'll certainly do that. And we're pursuing a lot of other avenues too. The target is to have the boiler work and the drivers done by this June. And we're on track right now to make that. So hopefully that'll come along because that is certainly a key part of it. Just for a gee whiz things, what do things look like down in the lower left, as you look at it, is the inner throat sheet, which as you can see, it looks like it's about 120 years old. A lot to be done to that. The crown sheet was removed, so that gets us over here, where with the crown sheet gone, you can see a lot of daylight, and then you can appreciate the fact that we're looking at somewhere north of 500 stay bolts that have to be installed in the locomotive when it goes back together. But they're a critical part. Obviously, the crown sheet, very critical, and the stay bolts that hold it in its position. Okay, the subcontractors and other contractors that are doing work, they're at Tennessee Valley Railway Museum. They are, we had a joint purchase with them. They needed some boiler tubes. KRM needed boiler tubes, and I think there's a third museum that needed some too. So they made a joint buy, and it saved everybody a lot of money. TVRM is also doing a swagging process where they're taking the superheater tubes that down from 5.5 inches diameter to 4.5. And you say, well, why do that? And part of the reason is KRM and its operation will never need superheated steam to the degree that a 5.5 inch tube would provide. So it again saves some money to do this. Age of Steam Roundhouse, they'll do the outer diameter of the wheels after the contractor gets through with them, which includes a new axle for the #1 driver. So next generation, when they get through, they'll go up to Age of Steam. Upcoming work at KRM. They'll be working on getting the frame ready. As we speak, there's a few volunteers working on the frame at the museum today. So frame gets ready, wheels come back, they can begin that part of the reassembly. Volunteers always welcome. If you think HO or TT or N scale is too small for you, and you want to work on something really big, and no experience necessary, although it's certainly helpful, but there's plenty of things to be done that anybody can pick up on. KRM has other artifacts, and actually about 100 more of them. 2/3 of the existing steam locomotives from the L&N are at KRM, 152 and coincidentally 2152. which is an 080. The third accident locomotive is down at Corbin. It's 2132. 770, we're trying to get it looking as pretty as it is in that picture. A lot of the work on it that we had hoped would have it in paint this past fall, just didn't get that far, so it'll be next spring. This is another piece of equipment that KRM has. It's an SW 1500, was originally built in 1970 as LNN 5003. And this is sort of a reminder to us that even though we're primarily talking about a steam locomotive, that's significant to a lot of us, well, a lot of people, but it's certainly us gray-haired folks. But a lot of the younger generation, it's not as meaningful. And to them, something like an SW 1500 is pretty cool. So it's nice to have this and some of the more modern pieces we have as well. Also, we have an office car 363, which late in its time with the LNN got named to Kentucky. It is at a contractor right now getting a new roof put on it. It had some issues with the roof, and that causes other problems. So there's a $54,000 expenditure that, and you think model railroading is expensive. There's hardly anything you can do on a real piece of equipment that doesn't come with a 5-figure number.
Charlie, was that car on site when we had our?
That is
this past summer?
It was on site. It is gone right now to Tell City.
Because I don't remember seeing it.
Yeah, it was gone already when you walked down.
We had
Yeah,
taken care of
it's
it.
been down there for a while. And the contractor, a lot of his stuff is in open air or not in a heated building, so it's affected by weather too. One piece we're really happy to have is the former plantation pine, which is currently named Colorado pine. It was part of the empire that, can't think of the guy's name, that went bankrupt, and KRM will suffice to say ultimately bought the car. It is a Pullman sleeper, so it gives us a nice modern example of this. It will be nice to have as a premium car for operations, but it also is a Tell City. The body work has been done on it. As soon as the weather improves, it will get the from primer to the finished coat of paint on it, and we're happy to have that. This is a piece we're very happy to have, is a little Woody caboose, LNN 559. There are a number of little Woody cabooses on, but this provides a sort of a segue from prototype to model, in that there are a lot of models around, but this and its sister cabooses were handy in development of the LNN Historical Society's model of little Woodies, but also there were several people who've come down, and it has been helpful in putting their resin kits together to see the real thing. And for instance, how the brake gear went together on the car and various other details. So with that having available, these prototype cars is often handled to modelers, are handy to have for modelers who want to portray things accurately. So we're going to shrink our viewpoint down now, again, from the big stuff, not in quality, but in size. The editor's column in the February issue of Model Railroader, his title caught my attention more actually than the other article, and that is making accurate models from reality. So again, having the prototype stuff around is nice sometimes as far as what we want to portray, because certainly in my lifetime of model railroading, there has been a quantum leap in both the information available and then certainly the models and the products that you have to make cars that are just so accurate that it's you almost feel like you're looking at the real thing now. And also the aspect, again, before we totally leave the prototype, there's lots of aspects of modern railroading that are far removed from what they used to be, but we see some of that with modeling, and that is a lot of people now operate their model railroads with timetables and train orders. So people are familiar with an operational aspect that for the most part has been gone for, in many cases, 50 years. Mm-hmm. But you can still find that on model railroad. So when you talk about a train order, you don't get that blank stare of, like you just arrived from Mars and what are you talking about? It's also nice to have models as far as the prototype, since they are three-dimensional. Photos are nice, drawings are nice, but being able to figuratively walk around a structure or a car is sort of nice to really get a feel for what that is in 3 dimensions. This is a model of HK Tower, and again, a lesson learned here, and I'm sure it's happened to all of us. I built this by scaling from various photos because I found an HK Tower drawing at the U of L archive, but it was of or actually I had acquired, there was another, we'll get to the archive sooner. I had acquired a drawing, but it was never built. It was a smaller version of the tower than this. And ultimately, after I built it, of course, I run across in a box that was not labeled at the archive, a drawing of this station. So, or that tower, I should say. Model can convey an evolution of what we see here. Here's three gondola cars, one of which is a wood-sided car, steel underframe, which went out of vogue, 100 years ago onto the steel cars we're acquainted with. Or, I like wood-sided box cars. So it's nice to be able to model them accurately and preserve the look of those for posterity. KRM also does have a model railroad section. Again, if anybody would like to volunteer on the model railroad there, you'd be perfectly welcome. So come on down, or if you'd like to see it on your next visit, which I'm sure many of you looked at it when you were down there recently. We'll move on now, lastly, to the written word. And not coincidentally, NMRA has an achievement in the achievement program, has the author aspect. And I know the focus there is writing about modeling. But again, there's that intersection of modeling and prototype when we look particularly at what some people model. I'm thinking of the Yosemite Valley, which is quite an accurate model of that railroad as I understand it and so forth. The old axiom, write what you know, is certainly true, but also sometimes you want to write what you know a little bit about and would like to know better. So you delve into it and you can share that information. So research on all this stuff is very important. There are lots of avenues to accommodate that, and you certainly could do so. One of the books that was, or actually two books, is a trackside around Louisville books that I was a co-author with several other people, Rick Tipton, John Campbell, and Charlie Kastner. At the onset of that project, it was noted that we should do more Morning Sun like picture books. So it was a Morning Sun books project, but it was mentioned that, gee, we ought to record as much history as we can of locations, train operations, and so forth in Louisville, because if we don't do it, who else might do it? That's not to say nobody would, but why assume someone else will if it could be done by others? From another standpoint, we mentioned equipment, but also places and structures are interesting to model. In the right-hand corner, as you look at this, we see Limestone Spring which still exists. Most of the distillery structure is all gone now, but the building, which was not a station, it was the office building, L&N lease space down in the bottom corner on the right end of it. Here we see a plat of New Hope, Kentucky, and they're golden for people who want to model a particular railroad, whether it's the L&N or somebody else, knowing what structures were in a town, where were they in relation to the railroad tracks and so forth. So those things can be fun to look at, and also they can be helpful to the modeler to get an idea of what they might include on their model railroad, whether it was that particular prototype or not.
Sanborn map?
That is not a Sanborn. That is actually an L&N plat. So those are great to come by, but hard to find. So Sanborn, everybody I think that is interested in maps and where structures are, they're gold too. They're really helpful in that they show an accurate depiction of where something was, how big it was, at least the footprint of it. So you might want to give being an author a try. Certainly, if you do, strive for accuracy. There is just so much misinformation out there. It's incredible, and it's astounding what people don't know in some fact. Grammar matters. If you use something like Microsoft Word, it will help you in that regard. The pie card, Bob Dawson, if he were here, I'm sure he'd say the same for their chapter chatter. There's local things to write from to cut your teeth. If you're interested in trying that, always helpful. I know editors, whether it's the people at what used to be Kalmbach are always looking for good articles, so it would be very much appreciated. You get tips from other authors. Steve Lasher has published a lot of articles that are quite interesting, and he knows how to do it. Historical societies, museums, archives are good sources for information and inspiration. And it's sort of all things go around. As was mentioned, I was one of the co-authors on the Big Emma book. KRM was quite helpful there in that there's an archive at KRM that has things that go back into when the museum was formed, the trip that was operated behind M1 1962. That's where a lot of that data come from that was used in the book. So it's really great. And it's not coincidentally that the final chapters of the Big Emma book deal with modeling in M1, because the L&N Historical Society, who was the sponsor of that project, they recognize that a lot of people are modelers who are going to be reading this book and are interested in portraying on their layout or their individual models getting the modeling accuracy. So in conclusion, there's many ways to preserve the history of railroading, the big stuff on down to the models that you have, and preserving the interest and motivation of people to see these things that are of interest to us. So we certainly thank you, Division 8 members, for your past support and your interest in this, and happy to entertain any questions. And again, if any of you are acquainted with anybody in a organization that can make significant contributions, you know, people have named names, but if you know, hey, you want a person to talk in X, let me know, and we would be happy to follow through and talk to that person for donations to support the preservation that is done there. So any questions or comments?
Okay, thank you, Charlie.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Charlie. Appreciate it. Very, very interesting.
And that's it for today. Thanks for coming.